The courtroom was thick with tension. Officer Daniel Gray sat on one side, staring straight ahead, his face stone cold. He was the town's hero for many years, always showing up to help people and make the community feel safe. He had friends here, loyal supporters, and even families who would point to him and say, "There's the cop who saved us." But today, he was facing a conviction, accused of unfairly targeting and arresting a young boy based on nothing but a wrong guess and a gut feeling. That boy was Jamie Rivers, a teenager who had never gotten into trouble a single day. When the judge finally read the verdict, guilty of misconduct, a hush fell over the room. Jamie's family squeezed his hand, relief washing over them like they'd been holding their breath for years. They felt that maybe, just maybe, justice was possible. But as Jamie and his family stood to leave, they caught sight of something that made their hearts drop. Outside the courthouse doors, a group of people had gathered, holding signs that said, "Free Officer Gray," and "He did nothing wrong." They chanted in unison, some holding hands and some holding the American flag, as if the officer were the victim. It didn't matter what Jamie had gone through. These people were here to defend the person they believed was doing his job. Jamie's mother clutched his hand tighter. Could this conviction mean anything if half the town believed it was wrong? Would the city stand with the truth, or would they follow Officer Gray no matter what? Jamie Rivers had been pedaling his bike down his street a few months earlier on a sunny Saturday afternoon. He was just a regular kid with a love for soccer, a knack for sketching, and a big smile that people couldn't help but return. Jamie had saved up for his bike by doing chores around the neighborhood. It was a beautiful red bike with black handlebars and bright white wheels, and he was proud of it. Jamie was going to meet his friend Marcus to play video games. They lived a few blocks apart, and Jamie enjoyed zooming down the street, the wind in his face. He'd almost reached Marcus's house when he heard the sirens. Blue and red lights flashed, and Jamie's heart leapt into his throat as a police car pulled beside him. "Hey, kid!" Officer Gray's voice boomed. "Stop right there!" Jamie skidded to a halt, unsure why a police officer was stopping him. Officer Gray stepped out of the car, and his eyes narrowed as he looked Jamie up and down. "Where'd you get that bike?" the officer asked, his tone sharp. Jamie blinked, confused. "Two bought it, sir," he replied. But Officer Gray's eyes didn't soften. "Funny, because there was a report of a stolen bike in this neighborhood that looks a lot like that one." Jamie felt his stomach twist. "I didn't steal it. This is my bike. I saved up for it." "That's so?" Officer Gray's voice was cold. He pulled out his radio and said, "I'm stopping a suspect in the recent bike theft report." Jamie's heart raced as he looked around. People were peeking out their windows, whispering to each other. He wanted to scream that he hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't stolen anything. But Officer Gray didn't seem interested in listening. Before he knew it, Jamie felt cold metal circle his wrists. He was being handcuffed. "What are you doing?" Jamie asked, his voice shaking. "I didn't do anything." Officer Gray only looked at him with a hard stare. "We'll see about that." When Jamie's parents arrived at the police station, they were horrified. His mom's voice wavered as she asked Officer Gray why her son was being held there. "What did he do? Why did you arrest him?" Officer Gray replied, "We had a bike theft report in the area, and he matched the description." "But that's his bike," Jamie's dad said firmly, trying to stay calm. "We've got receipts to prove it." After several hours and much questioning, Jamie was finally allowed to go home. But the experience left him shaken. He'd never felt like that before, humiliated, angry, and scared all at once. Even though the police had let him go, people in the neighborhood kept whispering. They'd seen him handcuffed. Some kids at school made jokes, calling him a troublemaker or thief. Jamie felt like he'd lost a part of himself, something he could never return. His parents were furious and decided they needed to do something. They knew Officer Gray had acted unfairly, assuming Jamie was guilty without proof. So they made the tough decision to go to court. The trial stirred up the town in ways Jamie couldn't have imagined. Some people believed he deserved justice and that he shouldn't have been treated that way. But others, including many who knew Officer Gray, thought the cop had just been doing his job and protecting the community. They couldn't believe a boy's family would try to take down someone who had spent years protecting their streets. Day after day, Jamie's family sat in the courtroom, listening to people argue. Some said Officer Gray had no reason to treat Jamie like he did. They pointed out that Gray had never asked Jamie questions or Evie, and given him a chance to prove the bike was his. Others defended Officer Gray, saying he couldn't have known the truth and that Jamie's reaction had been suspicious. Jamie often wondered if it was worth it. The tension in town was growing. People argued in stores, neighbors avoided each other, and friendships broke. Sometimes even Jamie doubted if things would ever be the same. For Jamie, the most challenging part wasn't the trial itself. It was what happened outside of the courtroom. People whispered when he passed by. Friends who used to hang out with him barely spoke to him now. Some kids avoided him at school as if being near him would somehow cause trouble for them, too. A few blamed Jamie, saying, "You didn't have to make such a big deal out of it." But Marcus, his best friend, stayed by his side. "Don't listen to them," Marcus said, trying to cheer him up. "They don't know what it's like." Still, Jamie could see how much things had changed. Even his parents seemed different, more serious and protective. They stopped letting him ride his bike around the neighborhood alone, always worrying someone would confront him or try to pick a fight. One day, Jamie overheard his parents talking late at night. "This isn't right," his dad said in a hushed tone. "People here are treating us like we did something wrong, but all we're doing is asking for fairness." His mom sighed. "I know, but maybe things have to get harder before they get better." Jamie's dad hugged her. "Maybe so, but it shouldn't be like this for Jamie. He's just a kid." Jamie lay awake in bed, feeling mixed emotions, anger, sadness, and a deep worry that things would never return to normal. During one of the trial days, the defense called Officer Gray to the stand. He stood tall, his police uniform still sharp despite the recent months of stress. His supporters filled the benches, nodding and muttering words of encouragement as if they were cheering on a hero in battle. The prosecutor asked him, "Officer Gray, why did you stop Jamie Rivers that day?" Officer Gray responded calmly, "There was a recent report about a stolen bike in the area, and I had reason to believe that the boy fit the description." The prosecutor pressed, "But did you have any solid evidence that he was involved in the theft? Did you see him acting suspiciously or behaving in a way that would suggest guilt?" Gray hesitated, just for a moment. "Well, he was riding a bike that matched the description, and when I stopped him, he seemed nervous." "Did you ask him any questions to confirm his story?" Officer Gray faltered, glancing toward his supporters. "No, I didn't. I believed that his reaction spoke for itself." The courtroom was silent. Jamie's family watched closely, holding their breaths. Then the prosecutor asked, "Officer Gray, would you have acted the same way if the boy riding that bike looked different? If he looked like someone from your own family?" Officer Gray's face flushed, but he didn't respond. His silence filled the room with tension as everyone held their breath. For the first time, the community could see that Officer Gray's assumptions weren't as fair as they'd believed. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was packed, with people crowding around to see the outcome. Jamie's family sat anxiously on one side, while Officer Gray's supporters sat on the other, their faces hopeful. The judge read out the verdict. "Guilty of misconduct." Gasps filled the room. Jamie's parents hugged him tightly, relieved that the court had recognized the wrong done to him. Jamie felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, yes, but also sadness that things had come to this. Jamie and his family prepared to head home outside the courthouse, hoping this chapter of their lives could finally close. But when they stepped outside, they were greeted by a crowd of Officer Gray's supporters, holding signs. "Justice for Officer Gray. He's our hero. Protect our police." Jamie's heart sank, and his family's relief felt like it was slipping away. The conviction didn't seem to matter to these people. They still defended Officer Gray as if he'd done nothing wrong. As Jamie looked around at the crowd, he spotted a few familiar faces, neighbors he'd known all his life, friends of his parents, and even his old soccer coach. It was like a wall between him and the people he thought he knew, built on things he didn't fully understand. In the following weeks, Jamie's family found it difficult to shake the feeling of isolation. They noticed fewer neighbors stopping to chat and fewer friendly nods as they walked around town. Jamie's parents debated whether to stay in the city or move somewhere new where they wouldn't be judged for standing up for their son. One afternoon, Jamie sat on the steps of his house, looking at his red bike, which had started all of this. He felt pride and sadness. It was something he'd worked hard for, but it had also brought so much trouble. Then Marcus came over and sat beside him. "You know, none of this is your fault," he said, handing Jamie a piece of paper. On it was a drawing Marcus had made, a picture of Jamie riding his bike with a massive smile. "I drew this because I thought you should remember what it felt like before all this happened, when you were just happy and free." Jamie smiled, touched by his friend's kindness. "Thanks, Marcus. It means a lot." As they sat together, Jamie felt a little spark of hope. He realized that not everyone was against him, and maybe he could find a way to rebuild his life. As time passed, a few community members began to speak up, admitting they'd never really thought about what Jamie had gone through. They realized how quickly they'd sided with Officer Gray, and some apologized to Jamie and his family. But Jamie also understood something important. Only some were going to change. Some people would always see things from their perspective. It wasn't easy, but he learned he couldn't let their opinions control his life. With his family's encouragement, Jamie began speaking at local events and schools about his experience, hoping to help others understand what he had learned about fairness and respect. Though the town remained divided, Jamie grew stronger. He realized that standing up for himself was hard but worth it. With Marcus by his side, he continued biking around the neighborhood, no longer afraid of what people might think. He knew who he was and what he believed in, and that was enough. As for Officer Gray, he retired early from the police force, and his reputation was always quite different. Some continued to see him as a hero, while others questioned his choices. But for Jamie, the memory of that day became a source of strength, a reminder of what it meant to stand up for the truth, even when it felt like the world was against him. And as Jamie rode his bike down the familiar streets, he knew that while some things might never change, he had the power to shape his path forward.